Hey, my name is Sean. This is going to be the fourth game of the third Tier 1 con that I played in. Sadly, Game 3 the file got corrupted and I was unable to use it. But I do have Game 4 here. It's a longer game out of the three of them, but I think it's still a pretty enjoyable game. So first I'd like to thank anybody who subscribed and who likes these videos. I really do appreciate it. And if you do enjoy these videos, please like and subscribe and comment anything you'd like to see down below. I do appreciate all of that. And let's get into the video. Let's get into the decks. First we have Yellow playing Tybalt Nas. This is a Rakdos Turbo Nas deck that aims to cast an early game ad nauseum and win through Underworld Breach lines. Going second, we have Blue playing Kadena Morph Midrange. This deck aims to use its commander Kadena along with a lot of powerful morph creatures and counterspells to slow the game down and then win through a Thassa's Oracle combo. Going third, we have Green on Yeva. Draw Go. This is a green Stompy deck that aims to use Yeva's ability to cast powerful creatures with Flash and features a lot of other powerful green commanders. It aims to win by establishing an infinite mana combo. And then finally we have Red playing Green-White Selvala Storm. This is a two-color Storm deck that aims to generate infinite mana and use Selvala as its main card draw outlet. Let's get into the game. Yellow starts the game off by playing a snow-covered swamp. He casts a Chrome Mox. When it enters the battlefield, he imprints a deflecting swat. He then casts a Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and then discarding 2 cards. He discards a Pyroblast and a Chaos Warp. Blue starts his turn off by playing a Waterlogged Grove and then passes to Green. Green plays a Gaia's Cradle and then follows that up by casting a Jeweled Lotus. He then follows the Jeweled Lotus up with a Mana Crypt. He then sacrifices the Jeweled Lotus in order to cast his commander, Yeva, Nature's Herald. He then taps Gaia's Cradle and casts a Wild Growth, enchanting itself. He then passes to Red, who starts off by playing a Brushland, taking 1 damage to it in order to cast a Carpet of Flowers. Yellow starts his second turn off by playing a City of Traders. He then flashes back Faithless Looting from the graveyard, once more drawing 2 cards and then discarding 2 cards. He discards a Reanimate and a Demonic Consultation. He then passes to Blue, who plays a Tarnished Citadel, and then takes a damage from his Waterlogged Grove in order to cast a Talisman of Curiosity. Green starts his turn off by playing an Emergent Zone. He then plays a Survival of the Fittest, and then moves to combat. He swings his commander Yeva, Nature's Herald, at Yellow, hitting him for 4 damage, down to 36, and hit it with 4 commander damage. Red then starts his turn off by playing an Emergent Zone. He then passes to Yellow. Yellow then casts his commander Valki, God of Lies. When Valki enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals their hands. From there he chooses 1 creature of the revealed and exiles that. He chooses to exile an Occam Adversary from Blue, a Selvala Heart of the Wilds from Green, and a Dryad Arbor from Red. And then he plays a Command Tower as land per turn, and when it enters the battlefield he sacrifices his City of Traders. Blue starts his turn off by playing a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, loses 1 life, and searches a Bayou onto the battlefield. He then takes 2 damage, and then casts his commander Kadena, Slinking Sorcerer. He, through Kadena's ability, casts a Morph for free, and when it enters the battlefield he draws a card. Green loses his Crypt roll to start his turn, and then once again swings his commander Yeva, Nature's Herald, at Yellow, hitting him for 4 commander damage, down to 32. Red starts his turn off with a Wooded Bastion, takes 1 more damage from Brushland, and casts his commander, Selvala Explorer, Returned. He then passes the turn to Yellow, who plays a Gemstone Caverns, and then pays 4 mana in order to make Valki a copy of the exiled Occam Adversary. He then moves to combat, swinging Valki at Red, hitting him for 2 damage, down to 36, and then passes. Blue starts his turn off by playing another Morph through Kadena, and then draws a card. He then follows that up by playing an Underground Sea. He then casts a Simic Signet and then passes the turn to Green. During Blue's end step, Green activates Survival of the Fittest. He discards an Uvenwald Tracker and charges up a Glade Muse into his hand. Through Yeva's ability, he casts Glade Muse with Flash. He then once more moves to combat during his turn and swings Yeva at yellow, hitting him for 4 down to 28. Red starts off by playing an Arid Mesa. He cracks it and shocks in a Temple Garden. He then plays a Smothering Tithe. Blue responds to this by casting a Fierce Guardianship for free, targeting the Smothering Tithe. Red responds by casting an Autumn's Veil. Blue then responds by megamorphing his Stratus Dancer, and when it flips over, he targets the Autumn's Veil. Red then activates Selvala, and each player reveals the top card of their library. Yellow reveals a Memnite, blue reveals a Grim Horsespex, green reveals a Forest, and red reveals a Veil of Summer. And then red adds 3 mana to his mana pool and gains 3 life. He then casts the Veil of Summer using one of the floating mana, and then it resolves. He draws a card. Stratus Dancer's ability fizzles. Autumn's Veil then resolves. Fierce Guardianship fizzles, and then finally Smothering Tithe resolves. He then uses another floating green mana to cast a Crop Rotation, sacrificing the Brushland. He searches up a Wirewood Lodge and puts it onto the battlefield. He then spends a floating green mana, activates Wirewood Lodge, to which green responds to by casting a Beast Within, targeting the Smothering Tithe, triggering Glade Muse, and then triggering Tithe. He draws a card, and then red creates a treasure. Then Beast Within resolves, and then green casts a Heartwood Storyteller, once more triggering Glade Muse and drawing him another card. And then Selvala untaps. Yellow starts his turn off by playing a Soul Ring, triggering Heartwood Storyteller. Each of his opponents then draw a card, and then Soul Ring resolves. He then moves to combat, swinging Valki at green, hitting him for 2 damage down to 35. He then plays a Memnite, which he then follows up by playing Sulphurous Springs as land per turn. He then takes 1 damage from the Sulphurous Springs in order to cast a Necropotence, triggering Heartwood Storyteller and drawing each of his opponents 3 cards, or drawing a card. He then pays 4 life and exiles the top 4 cards of his library, and then puts them into his hand at the beginning of the next end step. Blue starts his turn off by playing a Mana Confluence. He then plays an additional Morph through Kadena's ability, and when it enters, draws a card. He then moves to combat, slaying Kadena and then Morph at yellow, and Stratus Dancer at green. He hits yellow for 5 and green for 3. During his post-combat main phase, he flips over Brine Elemental, and each of his opponents now skip their next untapped step. Green rolls for Crypt and wins the flip, but skips his untapped step. He starts off by playing a Forest as land per turn, and then passes. Red moves to his turn and starts off with the Sylvan Tutor through Carpet of Flowers, triggering Heartwood Storyteller. Each of his opponents draw a card, and then Sylvan Tutor resolves. He then searches his library for a Kyrian Ranger and puts it on top. He then activates Selvala, and each player reveals the top card of their library. Yellow reveals an Arcane Signet, blue reveals a Bloom Tender, green reveals a Duskwatch Recruiter, and red reveals a Kyrian Ranger. He then gains 4 life and adds 4 mana to his mana pool. He then spends a floating mana to cast Kyrian Ranger. He then bounces a Temple Garden back to hand through Kyrian Ranger's ability and untaps Selvala. He then replays Temple Garden, shocking and taking 2 damage. He then activates Selvala, and each player again reveals the top card of their library. Yellow reveals a Mind Stone, blue reveals a Force of Negation, green reveals a Cavern of Souls, and red reveals a Green Sun Zenith. He then gains 3 life and adds 3 green mana to his mana pool. He then casts a 2 Arms, triggering Heartwood Storyteller. Each of his opponents then draw a card, and then 2 Arms resolves. He draws a card and untaps his creatures. He then casts a Green Sun Zenith for 1, triggering Storyteller, and each of his opponents once more draw a card. Blue then responds by casting a Force of Negation, targeting the Green Sun Zenith, triggering Heartwood Storyteller, and drawing each of Blue's opponents a card. Then Force of Negation resolves, and the Green Sun Zenith is countered. He then activates Selvala once more, and each player reveals the top card of their library. Yellow reveals an Ancient Tomb, blue reveals a Diabolic Intent, green reveals a Manglehorn, and then red reveals a Flooded Strand. He then adds 2 mana to his mana pool and gains 2 life. He then spends 1 mana and uses the treasure to cast Eladamri's Call, triggering Heartwood Storyteller, drawing each of his opponents a card. Eladamri's Call then resolves and he tutors up a Wirewood Symbiote into his hand. He then spends a floating green to cast a Fintorn Elves. He then follows that up by spending another floating green to cast a Wirewood Symbiote. With Wirewood Symbiote on the stack, yellow casts in a Braid, targeting Kyrian Ranger, triggering the Heartwood Storyteller. Each of yellow's opponents then draws a card. A Braid then resolves and the Kyrian Ranger is destroyed and Wirewood Symbiote resolves. Red then activates Wirewood Symbiote, untapping Selvala and then activating it once more. Each player reveals the top card of their library. Yellow reveals a Kiki-Jiki, blue reveals a Kadena Silencer, green reveals a Wooded Foothills, and red reveals an Angelic Ascension. He then adds 3 mana to his mana pool and gains 3 life. He then casts a Fintorn Elves, and then moves to combat, swinging the 3/3 Beast token at yellow. He hits yellow for 3 down to 15, and then passes the turn from there. Yellow starts off his turn by playing an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, losing 1 life, and puts a Badlands into play. He then casts a Culling the Weak, sacrificing his Memnite, triggering Heartwood Storyteller. Each of his opponents then draw a card, and then Culling the Weak resolves, and he adds 4 black mana to his mana pool. He then casts a Rain of Fill, spending a floating black mana. Once more triggering Heartwood Storyteller, and then each of his opponents draws a card. Rain of Filth then resolves, which he follows up by a Grim Tutor, once more triggering the Heartwood Storyteller. Then, with Grim Tutor on the stack, red activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Fintorn Elves in order to untap Selvala. Then Grim Tutor resolves, he searches up a card, loses 3 life, and then sacrifices 2 lands in order to cast a Feed the Swarm, targeting Heartwood Storyteller. Heartwood Storyteller then triggers, each of his opponents then draws a card, and then red activates Selvala, and each player reveals the top card of their library. Yellow reveals a Blood Crypt, blue reveals an Elves of Deep Shadow, green reveals a Forest, and red reveals a Karametra's Acolyte. Then he adds 2 mana to his mana pool and gains 2 life. Then Feed the Swarm resolves, the Storyteller is destroyed, and yellow loses 3 life. He then follows that up by exiling a Simian Spirit Guide, adding 1 red mana to his mana pool. He then spends 1 red mana to cast a Rite of Flame, up to adding 2 mana to his mana pool. He then spends 2 mana to cast a Pyretic Ritual, adding 3 mana to his mana pool. He then sacrifices 2 lands, adds 2 black mana to his mana pool, and then casts a Yawgmoth's Will. Green plays a Worldly Tutor, triggering Glade Muse, drawing himself a card. Worldly Tutor then resolves, and he searches up an Ashaya into his hand. Then Yawgmoth's Will resolves. Yellow plays a Memnite from the graveyard, which he then sacrifices a land to cast Culling the Weak, and then sacrifices Memnite to Culling the Weak to add 4 black mana to his mana pool. He then follows that up by casting Pyretic Ritual and Rite of Flame from the graveyard, adding a total of going up to a total of 4 red mana in his mana pool. He then casts a Grim Tutor from his graveyard, taking 3 damage and searching his library for a card. He then casts the card that he tutors for, which was a Jeska's Will, choosing both modes and targeting green. With green has 21 cards in his hand, he adds 21 red mana to his mana pool, up to 22. He then exiles the top 3 cards of his library, exiling a Imp's Mischief, a Wheel of Fortune, and a Thrill of Possibility. He then casts an Imperial Seal, spending 1 black mana in his mana pool. He loses 2 life, searches up his library for a card, and puts it up top. He then casts a Thrill of Possibility, discarding a Beseiju, using 2 floating red mana and drawing a card. He then casts a Kiki-Jiki for 5 red mana. He then follows that up by casting a Zealous Conscripts for 5 red mana. He then demonstrates a loop of activating Kiki, targeting conscripts, creating a token, and then the token untapping Kiki. Does this infinite times, and then attacks for the win with infinite damage. Okay, so let's get into this. The card of the game is Heartwood Storyteller. In this game, I was really far behind, and then I was in a position where I did have a Necropotence out on my fifth turn, but even earlier on, I was so far behind that I actually cast Valki and not Tybalt. I just didn't have mana. I drew cards, but just couldn't find anything. But Heartwood Storyteller really got me back into the game. It drew the table a lot of interaction and was able to deal with when the Selvala player tried to go off because we saw Force of Negation, other counter spells being drawn, and a lot of it was occurred because of her Heartwood Storyteller. I entered my final turn with like 14 cards in hand because of this. One of my opponents had like 20 something cards in hand. And so it was just really powerful that it really brought me back into the game and stopped the Selvala player from going off. So I got to give it the card of the game. So let's get into post-game thoughts. So I had that early demonic consultation in my hand that I discarded to a faithless looting. I probably could have kept that and potentially tutored for a Naws or something like that. My biggest problem was that I knew this was a mid-range matchup, and this was also the final game of the day. Sadly, as I said earlier, Game 3 got deleted, which is disappointing, but or Game 3 as it already happened that had gotten deleted, but so I needed to win this game for any chance of going to the semifinals. I sadly didn't make it by just the opponent's win percentage, but so I didn't really want to risk it on an early game demonic consultation. Like I was close to having Nas mana, but if Nas was like the fifth card, like bottom five or even in the top six, there was a lot of places where if I cast Nas, I could have just lost at that point. So I think I decided just to grind the game out and make it long because I was playing basically three mid-range decks. They were not only one of them featured black, and only one of them featured blue, so I thought I definitely could grind with them. So I think OK My Adversary was really powerful though. It drew me like 3 cards total, which is not that great, but alright. And it did taking it did actually shut down my opponent. Like that Valki play, it took a Selvala out, which definitely slowed down the Yeva player, Dryad Arbor. Some synergies slowed down like Quirion Ranger because it took a Forest out of his hand, and then taking Oakham was good because my opponent obviously had a value engine in Kadena, but this gave me a value engine. So I think I played that right. I probably, if it was another game, if it wasn't like the final game of the day and really important, I might have consulted for something. Definitely would have been an option. But I think I made the right choice, and I'm obviously glad I made that choice because I did come out in the end. So thank you guys for watching, and hope you enjoyed.